As well as releasing the new financial information this week, Nintendo also updated the details of their top selling units on Nintendo Switch 2 and Nintendo Switch. In this video, we're going to look at the current highest selling games on both systems. We're going to also talk about the no-shows and the future projections, and we're going to start to look at the velocity of some of these evergreen games, which is part of a bigger project. So people who are on the Patreon, if you stick around at the end, there'll be a bit more detail on where I currently am with this research. So let's have a look first of all at some of the limitations of what we're going to look at. First of all, we should know that Nintendo only include information on games that sell 1 million units plus, which means that there are a number of Switch 2 games which could have made a top 10, but which sadly are not represented because they haven't met that threshold yet. There are currently only 6 Switch 2 games on this list. Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades do not count discretely, and so we don't have specific information on how the Nintendo Switch 2 editions are doing unless they're bought as specific games. And of course, there are a number of examples of titles which probably would make a list if they were counted with the Switch 2 version. Specifically, we know that it has been confirmed that Metroid Prime 4 did exceed 1 million sales, but clearly neither of the individual games have managed to do so, or at least not so far as Nintendo have reported. We also know that because of the cutoff, some games are slightly disadvantaged. So, for example, Star Fox only had a few days to sell in, although it has been the case in the past that titles released right at the tail end of a quarter have done pretty well even early in the life of a system. And anyway, let's have a look now at the Switch 2 top 6, because as I say, we can't get top 10. So we have Mario Kart World in at 15.39 million, then Donkey Kong Bonanza at 4.78 million, Pokemon Legends ZA Nintendo Switch 2 Edition at 3.99, Pokemon Pocopia at 3.68, Kirby Air Rides at 1.9, and Super Mario Party Jamboree Nintendo Switch 2 Edition coming in with 1.15, and it is a new entry even though it's not a particularly new game. It was, of course, launched with the Nintendo Switch 2 around July of last year, and it was something that built on the 2024 Super Mario Party Jamboree type, but it's still the first example of an older title getting into this list. Okay, let's have a look at the Switch top 10, and this is pretty much fixed. The actual names of the games have not changed for many, many quarters, and instead we just have new numbers. So we've got Mario Kart 8 Deluxe coming in at now 71.53 million, honing in, it should be said, on the roughly 80 million that Wii Sports sold back in the day. Then we've got Animal Crossing New Horizons at 50.29, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate at 38.14, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild at 34.06, Super Mario Odyssey at 30.80, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet 28.46, pulling ahead of Pokemon Sword and Shield at 27.26. And you've got to say, it's pretty impressive how consistent the Pokemon fanbase is right there. Then you've got The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom at 22.71, still quite a way behind. Super Mario Party, that's the original 2018 game, at 21.36. And New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, despite being surpassed by Super Mario Bros. Wonder, is still hanging in there at 10 with 19.1 million sold. Now, we'll have a look at some of the specifics of what's changed for these games, but before we do that, let's just have a look at the Switch 2 no-shows, because I think it's pretty interesting, this list of games that have not yet come to this top 6 list. They have not yet breached 1 million in sales. Okay, first of all, we've got the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom Nintendo Switch 2 editions. That's probably not enormously surprising since a lot of people would have bought those games on the Nintendo Switch. And so while many people might have purchased the upgrade packs, and of course, many people would have access to the upgrade packs already through the Nintendo Switch online service, it might be something that gradually over time we get to 1 million, but probably not in the time frame that we're going to see this reported by Nintendo, because by the time that happens, they will probably have more than 10 in their list. Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour, I guess, theoretically could make 1 million, but it would be a real kick in the face to some of the other games on this list if that were to happen before any of the other games reach it. Kirby and the Forgotten Land Nintendo Switch 2 edition, well, of course, that also had the original Forgotten Land to compete with, so for similar reasons to Breath of the Wild, it probably won't make 1 million anytime soon. Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, well, that is clearly the one that is the most interesting to a lot of people, and I'll go into a bit of detail about where I think that is in a second. Same with Mario Tennis Fever, Yoshi. The real mystery here is Star Fox, and it's very difficult to tell exactly where Star Fox could be because there isn't really any recent precedent for how these games sell, let alone with the boost of a movie. It was a little bit sad that it didn't reach 1 million in the first few days, but then who would have expected it to be anywhere close to that based on the profile of the series only a few months ago? I think it is pretty likely, I would guess, that it will be in the million sellers in the next quarter, but we'll have to see. Okay, let's do some deep dives then into some of these specific properties. So starting off with Yoshi. Yoshi's Crafted World had only 3 days to sell when it released in March 2019, about 2 years into the life of the Nintendo Switch, although with an install base not that much bigger than the Switch 2's is now, given the higher velocity of Switch 2 sales. After 3.75 years, it had 3.35 million. Now, adjusting this a little bit based on the fact that because there was only 3 days in the first quarter is on sale, the next quarter probably did have quite high numbers. On average, you can expect about maybe 100,000 units every quarter going to Yoshi's Crafted World, assuming that it was selling at a steady pace. And for reasons that I probably won't go into too much in this video, but which I will on the Patreon and in future videos, I think there is some evidence that some of these titles do end up selling at a fairly steady pace long term. Let's have a look at another example then, Metroid. So here we have Metroid Dread after 6 months. That was 2.9 million. After 15 months, it was 3.07 million. That implies that every quarter it was shifting about 50,000 units. Well, we don't have detailed figures for Metroid Prime Remastered. We know it sold 1.09 million after the first 6 weeks, although it wasn't actually on sale physically for all of that time. We also know that the combined Metroid haul on the Switch was 4.99 million in September of 2024, and that was for 2 games. So if we extrapolate the same velocity forward for Metroid Dread, and I think we can plausibly do that, then we could estimate that Metroid Dread sold around 3.42 million, and Metroid Prime Remastered sold at that point about 1.57 million, which would give Metroid Prime Remastered also a similar kind of long-term velocity to Metroid Dread of about 50,000 units a quarter. Okay, let's have a look at Mario Tennis. Well, Mario Tennis Aces has a particularly interesting sales trajectory. In June of 2018, after only 9 days, it had 1.38 million shifted. Now, they did have a early Switch bundle, which included Mario Tennis, and that might have helped quite a bit. Then in September, it added 0.78 million, then December, 0.37, and then after that, it added for the next 2 quarters where we have records 110,000 in those 2 quarters. And if we look at the number of quarters between June 2019 and December 2022, and if we break that down and divide it down, we get an average sales rate of 120,000 per quarter. That is an incredibly consistent rate of sales and is one of the examples that I was referring to earlier. Now, does that mean that it continued to sell at that rate? It's not completely clear. We only have the information for those, 4.5 years, but 4.5 years is a substantial period of time. You can completely understand why Nintendo decided to put Mario Tennis Fever out first. However, we have to consider Mario Tennis Fever. If Fever inherits Ace's sales velocity, well, that would imply that it could reach about 4 million in the generation. It doesn't need to hit it right away, it could just very gradually pick up those casual players. However, we don't know lots of things. Did Ace's sales actually slow down after 2022? And also, if Aces would have picked up gradual casual players coming into the property, will Fever simply cannibalize those players? Would they have been better off doing a quick Nintendo Switch 2 edition of the previous title, not really developing tennis so much, and therefore just continuing to sell aces? It's not entirely clear exactly where Mario Tennis is fitting in, and of course, it is obvious that it hasn't had the same instant impact as other titles because it has yet to reach 1 million, despite the fact that it had a movie pushing Mario at the same time. It's pretty interesting here to kind of imagine where it could be. So I think all these properties we just looked at, Metroid, Kirby, and Mario Tennis, obviously have the potential to hit 1 million, but how likely are they to do so? With Metroid Prime 4, the fact that the title is split between a Switch and a Switch 2 version means that if it got a similar kind of number to Metroid Prime Remastered, and given the tepid reception to the game in terms of reviews, there is some sense that it might not have matched that, but of course it did also have a lot of promotion. Well, if it was getting something in the region of maybe 1.2, 1.3 million, and that split was, 50-50, then we could be at the point where it's probably sold on Switch 2, maybe 700,000. Perhaps that's optimistic, of course. It could be that it's a bit less because most people still would have had Switches, but my guess is that a lot of people who were interested in Metroid Prime would have been more likely to be early adopters of the Switch 2 system. If it does manage to put on 50,000 a quarter, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see it in the next quarter, and after that we're probably going to be caught up with other things. Mario Tennis, on the other hand, I would be surprised if it doesn't cross that boundary, but it's not impossible to imagine it won't. And Yoshi, of course, is likely in the long term to pick up consistent sales, but it's not completely clear as to where it is at the moment. Another possibility, of course, is that the Zelda Wild duology comes out on top. Well, we can have a look back and see what the trajectory of these game sales on the original Switch were. The 2024 calendar year averages for Breath of the Wild were 250,000 million a quarter, and for Tears of the Kingdom, 318,000 units a quarter. Whereas on Switch 2, we can see that during this era, we're still talking about the Switch games, but we're talking about the Switch 2 era, 2025 and onwards, we're looking at 250,000 every quarter for Breath of the Wild, a marginal dip, but basically the same. And we're looking at a quite significant dip with Tears of the Kingdom to 196,000 units every quarter. Now, what that implies to me is that if there is a fraction of people who would normally have bought Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, but instead bought the Switch 2 versions, that probably would be represented by about 50,000 for Breath of the Wild, and that's not a typo, that is a significant rounding up from the 3,000 these numbers would strictly imply, and I'm just thinking that because basically you would expect there to be people who are new to the console and who are discovering Breath of the Wild, and I just don't believe that it's dipped quite that much, but I still think it's going to be pretty low. And then for Tears of the Kingdom, actually the numbers might suggest a slightly higher volume, but I'm not sure it'd be that high. I think 100,000 per quarter would be a reasonable estimate based on the difference, assuming that Tears of the Kingdom was going to continue to sell at roughly the same cadence. It had reached that sort of plateau phase that some game series reach, and so it was just a case of those audience members transferring to Switch 2. And you can imagine that Switch 2 would be a great opportunity for people who had played Breath of the Wild and broadly enjoyed it to step in to Tears of the Kingdom, given that it is a big sequel game. It's not necessarily a game that they had wanted to buy previously. Maybe it was just too big to really get into, but on a new console, why not? At any rate, that gives us the Switch sales estimates overall of, I'm going to say, this. I would reckon for September, we're probably looking at Splatoon Raiders entering the charts. Now, it's very difficult to tell precisely where it's going to end up, but bearing in mind that we do know that it is selling very significant numbers in Japan right off the bat, if we extrapolate based on what we know of Splatoon's more Japan-focused audience and kind of scale up appropriately, I reckon something in the maybe 2 millions is achievable. Could be more, could be a bit less, but that's just a pure guess. I'm not putting a forecast percentage to this. That's just a kind of estimate of where we might be. Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, if they continue to tick along at roughly the current pace, that's kind of where we're looking, 16 and 5 million respectively. Pokemon Legends ZA, 4 million. Pocopia, 4 million. I think that's going to outpace some of the other titles. Kirby Air Riders seems to be pretty much flat. And then you might expect Jamboree to continue. And then if there is going to be one that crosses the 1 million threshold, it could be Mario Tennis. But I think probably the more likely one is Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. Of course, I'd love to see Star Fox there. I'd love to see Fire Emblem. But Fire Emblem will have a real problem because it only will have a few days or a couple of weeks, I think, to sell in this particular quarter. And so I think we're probably, if you look back to the sales pace of Three Houses, which of course was a series high and on a slightly larger install base, I'd say you're probably looking at 600,000 for Fortune's Weave in the first couple of weeks. I think that means that it will eventually cross the million threshold, but probably not for this following quarter. Star Fox remains a mystery. I think Tennis Aces and Prime 4 will be a little bit under where we might expect them to get to. For next December, of course, we're going to have Legend of Zelda entering the top 10. We're going to have Switch Sports Resort, almost certainly Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, possibly another unannounced game, which is going to be a big seller of some description. I still think there's likely to be some kind of holiday game for the Mario property. And so I think it is decently likely that we're going to see a rounding out of that top 10 list, which sadly will make it a lot more difficult to identify exactly what is happening afterwards. Now, this data is all well and good, but it doesn't really give us much information to go on in terms of the trajectory of these games. However, if we break down just the April to June increases in the sales, we get a bit more of a flavour of what's happening. So Mario Kart World has an extra 690,000 sales, Donkey Kong Bonanza, 260,000, Pokemon Legends ZA Nintendo Switch 2 Edition, only 50,000. Pocopia, of course, was released right at the end of the previous quarter, so that put on a significant number, 1.27 million, and Kirby Air Riders has had just 30,000 sales. And then it's very hard to tell with Super Mario Party Jamboree, but obviously it was at least 160,000 because at 1.16 it across the million threshold, it would have needed to have been, 0.99 before. Okay, so that's exactly where we are with the Switch 2, but just for comparison, let's have a look at the original Switch sales. And we can see, in fact, that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has 450,000, Animal Crossing New Horizons, which of course has got quite a push recently with the Nintendo Switch 2 edition, that's on 380,000, Super Smash Bros. The same, Breath of the Wild 220,000, Mario Odyssey, bit of a push from the movie, 300,000 units sold in the last quarter, and with Scarlet and Violet and Sword and Shield you can see 180 and 100,000 respectively. Tears of the Kingdom, quite a bit lower now than Breath of the Wild at 150,000, and Super Mario Party at 40,000, and then New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe at 140,000. If we put that together, we can see that from the 16 titles in either the Switch or the Switch 2 bestseller list, yes, the runaway leader was Pocopia, but again, that's a bit of a cheat because it was ultimately a title that released very recently prior to the beginning of this quarter. Mario Kart World, though, well, that is out ahead, but look at Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. It's not that far behind. It is still going incredibly strong, and yes, of course, there was the movie, and I think it is significant that for many people, particularly those younger people who are going to see the movie for the first time at age 7, 8, 9, a lot of those people literally won't remember a world where many of these top titles released. They won't remember Mario Kart 8 Deluxe releasing, but they might not even remember Animal Crossing or Smash Brothers or Mario Odyssey releasing. These titles are all going to be as new to them, and so they can be sold as new to probably a fairly significant audience. Bonanza is fitting in there, but of course lots been happening to Bonanza in terms of other initiatives with the Donkey Kong Challenge and such like, so I don't necessarily think that we will see this number sustained, but it will be interesting to see what its resting point becomes, and then you have to look down quite a long way to see where you've got the likes of Pokemon Legends ZA and of course Super Mario Party. And what's interesting here is that Super Mario Party had 40,000 sales. That was the very original 2018 game. Super Mario Party Jamboree, well, we know it had a bit more than that, but we don't know exactly how much more, but it's still selling at a fair clip, even given the fact that it is an old game and there are 2 sequels. Okay, so this has been a bit of an initial deep dive into the data. If you're watching on the Patreon, then please do stick around because I'm going to go through some broader context from an ongoing project, some of the graphs and charts and tables that I'm currently looking through. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Please do consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.